Hey guys, welcome to Josh and Reed are Parents. I'm Reed,
I'm Josh.
and we're parents.
We're parents.
Welcome to episode 11. We are super glad you're here and that you're listening with us and following along. We've been in a conversation about masculinity and what it means to be a man and the ways that we find helpful as we try to navigate 21st century masculinity in a world that is super interesting. We've had a lot going on. Recently, I spoke at a local little conference here in Abilene. Had a really great time. Got to talk about teenagers and mental health and the role that like spirituality and faith plays in that. And it was really fun. And we opened the conversation with me. I kind of asked the room like, what are the things that you hear about teenagers? Like, what are the things that people tell you?
Mhm.
And then the room responded with like, well, they're entitled, they're lazy. Uh, the one person said they just don't want to work. Um, and so it was nice to be able to be like, I hear you saying these things, and I'll tell you from my experience, this my anecdotal experience of working with teenagers, really recently, but also just for the last decade, has been that our teens are actually overcommitted, and they are working really hard at all the things.
Right.
Most of the teens are doing multiple extracurricular activities with school, and then also trying to hold down a job or multiple jobs and that they are doing it their best to be great in school as well. And so in my work as a minister, I'm not encouraging to quit things, but in our conversations, we're just wondering like, what does it look like to invite you into actual rhythms of life that might be a little bit different. And so yeah, so that was a really fun experience to get to do and to be invited to speak at the conference and had a really good time with that. Yeah, so that's what's happening over here in the Abilene. What's going on with you?
That's really cool, man. I'm glad you got to do that with that group in particular. So Reed and I are teachers at heart, and like I enjoy speaking in front of people, which is like a weird thing when I say that out loud because people usually hate it, but it's like it kind of reminds me of being a teacher and connecting that way. And so I've gotten some opportunities. One of the things that we found in the Atlanta area, at least, I don't know if this is true, just like across America, but there's a pretty heavy interest, especially in and around like the school year, of like churches being really interested in how we lean into mental health, and especially when it comes to kids,
Yep.
right? And which I think is a fairly new phenomenon. I think for a long time, and this was, this dates us a little bit, but like for a long time, like mental health and spirituality didn't feel like they necessarily meshed, right?
Yeah.
But that is kind of like it's not necessarily the case as much as it was.
Mm.
And so I've gotten the opportunity to speak at I think three different churches now, at their like parenting mental health nights, or how to like one of them was titled Mentally Healthy Kids, and I retitled it Mentally Healthy Parents. And so
Yeah.
so anyway, that's been really,
Mm.
really fun. It's like a lot of the stuff that Reed and I workshop here on this podcast, and we work through it, are some of the things that are going into
Yeah.
those talks, specifically around like graceful parenting and how to approach parenting in a way that makes sense so our kids can be healthy.
Yep.
So it's been really fun. I really like to do that, and we'd love to do it more too.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think a lot of the conversation that I find really helpful is that move toward out of like a scarcity mindset that the answer is just to do more, like just to
Right.
press more, go harder. You're not trying hard enough. And instead to move toward actually, I wonder if there is enough, and I wonder what it would look like to lean into like
Yeah.
rest and maybe just pause for a second and take a breath. And then how the spiritual disciplines can even aid our parents to be fully present for our teens and that sort of thing.
Well, I think from my perspective too, like when we talk about, I think one of the reasons why they are overcommitted and they are being pushed in a lot of ways is because I don't think this is the whole reason, but one of the reasons is because of fear of parents. We've talked a lot about fear on this
Mm,
podcast, about like what they need to have, what they need to be happy, what they
yeah.
need to have to be like seen as valuable or
Mm,
competitive at the college level.
yeah.
And like so the reason why they're being overcommitted is because parents with most of the time with really good intent are trying to help their kids have everything they need,
Yeah.
and being able to like kind of like maybe reframe that towards like what if they already have enough, right? What if they are enough already? What if our
Mm,
fear doesn't have to drive us in all of these different things? It's a really, really cool way of like
yeah.
looking at it. It's also very, very difficult. I am in the midst of like raising a child and I struggle with these things,
Yeah.
which I think gives actually like connection to people in the room usually when we're talking. So
Yeah.
yeah, that's the kind of the way I kind of arrive at some of these discussions too.
Mm, man. Yeah. Well, Josh and I are working toward, hopefully, in the next like calendar year of getting a Josh and Reader parents, maybe some live events or I don't know what else to call them other than
You called
that.
it an experience, right? The Josh and
Oh,
Reader
I
Parents
did?
experience. I think
Experience.
I love that. I don't even know what it means, but it sounds great.
Experience. Pew, pew, pew. Smoke machine. Pew.
Yeah, right.
That's the only, I won't do it any other way.
I would
It's
be
got to have a
disappointed
smoke
without a smoke
machine.
machine. You're
It's
right.
got to have the disco ball lights, and it's got to have me doing the Steve Ballmer from the
Yeah,
Microsoft
the GIF.
drop. Oh, that's like my favorite clip. Um, yeah, but we would love to do some live events and either in churches or schools or whatever where we come and we talk about graceful parenting. We talk about the things we talk about here and we do it in the presence of parents and maybe even teens. We'd have to talk about what that would look like. And just have well-rounded and important conversations and hopefully take the air out of the balloon a little bit and allow
Mm,
some room to breathe and do some good work there.
yeah.
Because I think there's one thing that we both believe is that healthy parents are able to create space for healthy teenagers and healthy children to grow.
Man, yeah, I believe that. Yeah, I think these experiences that we've had speaking in this have been really fun, and we want to share them with more people.
Yeah,
And so yeah, like we're working on that. We're trying to find ways to make that work. So if you have something out there that you feel like could help us with that, let us
yeah.
know.
Let us know.
We'd be thrilled to talk about it. Reid, I'm interested in our discussion about masculinity last
Mm.
time. And so this is where I pause and say, the kind of the rhythm of our podcast has been a little bit changed over the summer just because our schedules were so kind of
Yep.
wild. We're going to try to be a little bit more consistent about it going through the fall. But one of the things I would say is I would really, really push people to go and listen to that last podcast, episode 10. Not because we're great, even though we're great.
Fantastic.
But I think it like does lead into it's pretty tight, it's pretty short, and it leads into this discussion fairly well. And it kind of you can see where we left off, which is around this idea of like how do we talk about masculinity in a way that makes sense? How do we talk
Yep.
about a masculinity that makes that's actually helpful and not hurtful to the people we care about, to the boys that we're trying to work with, to their sisters and the girls that they're living with and around, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like how do we come about this in a really helpful and healthy way? And like straight up and down, Reed, you and I have like struggled with like trying to figure out how to do this well, right?
Yes. Yeah. How do we have a well-rounded conversation about something that's already in like the zeitgeist right now?
Right.
Where there's like a swirling uh I don't even know, like a tornado of random information about masculine loneliness, about male loneliness, about like the stats of men dying by suicide at 4 times the rate of women, those sorts of things, just like floating around in the ether. And how do we like bring that down and have an actual conversation
Yeah.
that's going to like empower us to actually live and to
Right.
to raise boys and to work with teenagers who
Right.
are young men, um, and to do that well. And so we've really been wrestling about what that looks like.
You know, one of the things I did to brought us to this discussion and like since this discussion is leaned into a book by a dude named Richard Reeves. He wrote this. It's a book entitled "Boys and Men: Why the Modern Male is Struggling, Why it Matters, and What to Do About It." And so I think Reed, you tell me if you
Yeah.
agree with this. I think that the idea that men are struggling, young men especially, are struggling, is again the idea that you're talking about, like maybe in the zeitgeist, like it's out there
Yeah.
in general. But the answer to the question of like why and like does it matter is kind of like I don't know if we've answered it. You know, that's not really very answerable. And it's this interesting question about like why do they struggle so much and like is it just because suddenly feminism is rising and like just because like now suddenly we're asking young men to not be like the worst versions of themselves anymore? that's why they're struggling. And there's a sense
Yeah.
that why does it matter so much that boys are struggling? And I think the way that I would answer it and the way that Richard Reeves answered it in that book is like it matters a great deal because people are individuals and that humans, we need to like love people in the way that like humans are loved.
Yeah.
But then also because of like at a societal issue, if we're having young women beginning to rise in their understanding of themselves and their abilities and their opportunities, that does not necessarily mean that men are being called to like lessen or like not to be like have opportunities at all.
Right.
But I do think that there's a sense that like in a lot of ways, the way that we talk to young men about being masculine is things that they need to stop being, right? We often like what is a very, very common term is toxic masculinity
Mm.
and how they need to not be toxic, which I think you and I, Reed, agree with, right? I think you and I grew up in a sense in an era where toxic masculinity was still somewhat celebrated, and like I know I lived it out in a lot of ways, right? I don't know if that was your experience or not, but like that's something that you and I like lived through and are
Yeah.
trying to move away from that as we parent these boys that we have, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I always felt like toxic masculinity was kind of capturing something that is just like, well, we don't want to just call it misogyny.
Right.
Why don't we call it toxic masculinity?
Sure, sure.
And I think if we had just called it like misogynistic, it might have been more helpful, to be honest
Mm,
with you, because it's like, if I just call it what it is, it's like, but if we just called it what it is, it might have been more helpful to be able to say
sure.
like, oh, well, that's actually just what misogynism, like that's what that is. Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
to think that men inherently have more value than women is misogynistic,
Right.
or like the another version of it, like that it's the man's job to do these three things, and it's the women's job to do these three things, and that's the only job they can do, and that there
Right.
might not be cross talent or cross giftedness in those
Right.
areas or something like in those things. And I think it became like a zero sum game, like
Hmm.
you were saying, where because women are super talented, of course, like all humans are talented in their own ways, that like the idea was like, well, now men just have to like roll over and die,
Right.
or something, and that's the reason that's happening. And I said this in our pre-call, but like I'm kind of wondering like, well, the data is showing something that was true in the past. Like data is not like a live feed of what's happening, right? It's not like
Yeah.
when you go to the how many people are on Earth website and it shows you like this live update of how many people are being born all the time. You're like, I have no idea if that's right or not. It's probably just a really like
Yeah. It's just a mathematic version
it's
of what
it's
they've been
just
saying.
AI creating a
Right.
number,
Yeah.
which is great and cool. There's a lot of us. Um, but like data is showing something that's been true in the past and that is carrying this trend into now.
Right.
Um, and so I think I'm just kind of wondering, well, if men have been lonely for a while, and if men have been feeling isolated for a while, well, what does it look like then to create community where men are not isolated, where we
Right.
are we're not an island to ourselves? And I think this is where, like, as a Christian, I'm like, well, this is the work of the church
Right.
as a minister. Like, this is part of my job as a minister, right? Is
Right.
like facilitate community for the sake of what Jesus calls the kingdom of God,
That's right.
and that is uh, a really intentional thing that needs to happen.
Yeah.
Um, and um, and then in that, like you can press into that really even much further and to say, well, what does it look like in the church for men to be men?
Right.
Uh, and it and it, I don't think it looks like um, domineering power. I think it looks like Jesus,
Right.
self-sacrificial love and courage.
Man, I love that. I think that's exactly right. And I think one of the things that you and I've been talking about, and I would love for our listeners to like lean in on this about is like is thinking about the idea of why this conversation is difficult,
Yeah,
right? Um, I the way that I perceive this in general is that I think there's a little bit of a void, or like there's a lack of discussion around what do we talk about when we talk about like masculinity that we actually want our young men to have,
yeah,
right? Because I think people on that come from either my perspective politically or even theologically worry about even using the word masculinity because they don't want to
yep,
offend the people that they deeply care about and even believe in, like the movements, right? Like
mhm,
of feminism. And so like the idea of talking about masculinity in any way to help young men out is something that like might like seems uncomfortable. You and I were talking about this before. Like
Yeah.
we felt uncomfortable about it. We like
Yeah.
we can see like obviously this needs to be talked about, but we found discomfort. And what I think happens in the middle, this is something I think is what you were talking about too, is like is so vital and why we have to speak about it more is because if we don't, who fills that void, who fills that vacuum are people that we do not want our young men to be listening to. And like
Yeah.
one of the things that like the data shows really, really consistently, and which is we've known to be true, so really probably since the beginning of humanity, is that isolation breeds like loneliness, which breeds really, really bad outcomes,
Yeah.
right? And in the age of the internet, the place where the isolation like leads these young men is to bad places on the internet.
Yeah.
Places where like people like Jordan Peterson or Andrew Tate are like leaning into basically saying to these young men, you're right, they don't love you, they don't care about you, the people around you like see you as meaningless. Well, let me show you how to have meaning again. And they give them really, really like which draws young men into, and they give them really, really bad advice on how to be
Yeah.
men, you know? And so like I think
Yeah.
it's really important for people to be able to speak into this in a way to
Mhm.
like, no, let's think about how to have good masculinity, the kind of masculinity that Jesus calls us to.
Yeah. Yeah. And in the Christian imagination, I'm kind of like if for me, I always found it helpful of like, well, if the life of a Christian is producing fruit and the fruit of the spirit is what that is,
Yeah.
those are not traits that we talk about when we talk about American masculinity, the American man. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Maybe self-control in its ability to connect you to going to the gym and getting super ripped. Like that's it.
If you
Like
just
that's
had
the
some
only one.
discipline, you can make gains, right? That's
Right.
the only
Yeah.
one.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Like have discipline so you get in the ice bath so that you can
Yeah.
then go lift more weights. And then I'm lifting weights is super like it's healthy to go and work out. Those are fine. I'm not disparaging that. But I do wonder often about like masculinity connected to the fruit of the spirit and that like take peace for example.
Right. That's
Person
what I
of
was thinking of.
peace to be a person of peace. Well, it's going to require self-sacrificial love and not getting my way all the time.
Hmm,
And 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 to use like Andrew Tate is like the ultimate, like this absurd
hmm.
example. But he does have millions of people that follow him on his stuff because he's giving them a way of life. He's offering something that looks helpful on the front to them,
Sure.
but
Sure.
I think it's terribly harmful. Um, because it's saying unless you are the most powerful, unless you are the alpha, whatever that means, like we're wolves or something, then you are the weakest. Like it's like Ricky Bobby, if you're not first, you're last. Like that's absurd.
Which is not true. It's so dumb.
Well, Ricky, you could be second or third. Like, I don't know what you're talking about. Like, yeah, like it's just like it's insanity. But I think what you're saying is true that we haven't given men another way to think about it. Because
Yeah.
no, we haven't stepped in and said, well, courage to be a person of peace is actually really important.
Yeah.
Um, and and it gets kind of like stomped down as like that's foolish. Like that wouldn't actually work.
Right. Like the idea of like of really developing and cultivating or like our patience. Imagining helping our young men find joy.
Mm,
Do you know what I mean? Like one of the things that I would describe, yeah, you and I were teachers for a long time, that I would describe teenagers as like over the last like 10 to 15 years is like anytime that I found anyone enthusiastic about anything, I was overwhelmed with like excitement. Like because most of the way that you have to show up as a teenager right now,
yeah,
um, is like I don't care about anything.
yeah,
You know what I'm saying? Like it's a risk to care,
yeah,
right? And anytime that anyone is excited about anything, I was always like, let's be excited about something. Here we go. What if we were able to help young men cultivate joy, right? And I don't even mean happiness. I mean like the idea that this is a thing that brings joy and I'm excited about it, and that's something we lean into because it gives us
yeah,
life and hope and
yeah,
grace, like, you
yeah,
know, all the things.
yeah,
I love that. I love thinking about the fruits of the spirit as ways of like helping our young men like cultivate those things. That being the trajectory of masculinity, right? Like how can we as fathers, how can we as mothers how can we as parents figure out how to use that as a template um of really, really healthy, really, really good masculinity.
Yeah.
Um, I think a lot of like we talked a little bit about this too, like the idea of like in the Gospels, one of the things about Jesus that is so difficult for people to pin down, especially like the American Christian
Yeah.
culture to pin down, is that Jesus is not the winner that they want him to be. Right
Yep.
now, he is the conqueror. He's our king. He's the one that but he does not win in the way that we want him to win. He also doesn't win in the way the apostles want him to win, right? Like
That's right.
it's
Yeah.
again and again shows up as sacrificial, as aware of others, as not domineering,
As
as
weeping at the grave, right?
yeah, right. Like he as being sad and hurt and upset by things that are hurtful and sad. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like having
Yeah.
emotions, being intentional about like being by himself for a time that
Yeah.
helps fulfill and grow. I mean, all these things that like
Yeah.
honestly just doesn't like you know he's like sexuality was never a dominant part of his life. Do you see what I'm saying? Like as we present like you know maybe like the toxic or the misogynistic way of looking at masculinity as being like intensely sexual all the time. You know what
Yep.
I'm saying? Like
Yep.
anyway, so
Yeah.
like, if we look at Jesus in this way,
Mm.
he is not the prototypical male. You know, as we look at it inside of the American culture, a way of looking at it and yet we never really look at him as like kind of the direction of masculinity. I don't
That's
know if
right.
that makes sense to you.
Yeah, it does. And I see the way that he then empowers his his next leaders to then fill that same type of role of courage and like stepping into the next right thing, even if it feels like I don't know, I I don't know what to do is other than to say that like actually they belong in our community.
Right.
Um, that like the people that we've been told we're supposed to hate our whole lives actually belong like in here right now.
Yeah.
And the courage to do that is pretty remarkable. Um, yeah, and so like Jesus as a model for masculinity is such an interesting idea, and it's easy to. I even feel myself being like, I can just shrug it off. Like that's a silly, like what a silly idea. Like um, but I I actually think it matters a lot.
Might be really, really significant.
Might be really important
Right.
for Christian communities to lean into the fact that if we're claiming Jesus as our Messiah, that our men need to look more like him than they do, um, Caesar
Or like King David, right?
or even King David. Yeah,
Right. Yeah, like
yeah,
like which is like Jesus comes and replaces him as
right.
the
Like
true
this is
like leader of the
actually
kingdom
what the
of God.
Messiah looks like. That's
Right.
right. Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah,
And a lot of ways, if you look at like the trajectory of King David throughout the Old Testament, like he was the classic like male, right?
yeah,
With all the wives and all of the stuff and all of the things and all the strength and all of the wins on the battlefield, you
yeah,
know?
yeah, yeah.
And like
Saul's
Jesus
killed
comes
his
in.
thousands. David's killed his tens of thousands. Right? Like,
Exactly. Exactly. Exactly.
like
And
Tim
Jesus is
Allen,
from that
home
line.
improvement. A lot of
That's right. That's right. Like David is the
yeah,
prototypical
yeah,
and Jesus comes in and like usurps him, like comes in over the top inside of the kingdom of God.
yeah,
Um anyway, like there's so many different like ways of going about this.
yeah,
One of the places where I really see Jesus really like leaning into courage is in Matthew 4 where he goes through his temptation.
yeah.
And I love that chapter because it really lets us see the humanity of Jesus, which, by the way, when we talk about femininity and masculinity, we're talking like humanity, like how
Yeah,
people express humanity. You know
that's
what I'm
right.
saying? So anyway, in that chapter, you get to really see him be a real human.
Mm,
And the idea of like really like I really want things. My humanity like pulls me towards using
yeah.
my powers for my own, using my name for my own, being able
Yeah.
to show people that I'm not a fraud, being able to be
Mm,
powerful in ways to maybe even not die, which I think he like was afraid of, which makes sense. Like all of us are.
yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
I don't know. I see him in those moments saying like having tremendous like discipline and strength and courage to say like my purpose will be more important than what I desire. I will not let my fear dictate the way that I make choices. And
Mm,
honestly, if that's the template that we start with on how we begin to talk to young men about
yeah.
how to be good men,
Yeah.
I think that's a really, really good place to start.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. And in that story, uh, I love that there's the one where it's like, if you bow down to me, I'll give it all to you now.
Right.
I'll give you all the power. And Matthew's ends with that. Luke's flips it. Luke has an ending with the temple one, but which is interesting. But Matthew ends with the, if you
Right.
bow down to me, I'll give it all to you now. And he even conquered, like, for whatever reason in Matthew's imagination that would be harder to go through. I agree with Matthew.
Right.
Uh,
Right. Right.
anyway, but yeah, just that idea that like the easy path toward power and control, the domineering way of of um of aligning yourself with that way of being in the
Right.
world is alluring to all of us. And that, I think, the trait of a, I don't know, spiritually forming Christian man is to say, like, I feel that all the time, and I'm allowing the Holy Spirit to pull me back toward the image of Jesus that I see, that says I won't bend my knee to that type of power.
Hmm.
That it isn't the way to life. It isn't the way um, to fulfillment or joy or any of the other fruits.
Right.
But instead, I want my life to look like a different type of courage.
Yes. In that
Um,
moment, I see him having like being pulled from his human place of
yeah,
wanting those things, a
yeah,
desire, like, oh man, those are things I really desire. And yet, like what he has in front of him is
mm,
like his sense of purpose.
yeah,
Like I am more than just what I'm being pulled towards, right? I have a direction other than just what my like base level of desire is. Do you know what
mm,
I'm saying? And like I
yeah,
will, I
yeah.
will with all my might, and especially in this really difficult moment, like push myself towards that purpose, which I'm being
That's right.
called towards, instead
Yeah,
of just which like is this is the opposite of Andrew Tate. It's the
yeah,
very opposite,
that's right.
right? Like he cares, like, hey man, all the basis things that you want girls and cars and money and power and strength and beating people up, like that's what you deserve because you're a human, you're a man. And
Yeah,
Jesus is like, it's just the opposite.
mm,
Right? It's like to live the life that you're called to live, the life that you are needed for, to live the life that is actually a good life is not those things. It's this, right?
yeah,
And
yeah,
so I really, really like the idea of beginning to like help young men
yeah,
see what they are purposed for, and like try to help them like that be the guiding light instead of just the things that are kind of like our biggest call, the biggest pulls as humans, you know?
yeah, yeah. One of the articles that I saw the other day said, or yeah, today said, "Stop telling teenage boys they're toxic."
Hmm.
It was just the title of the article, and I was like, it was written, yeah, it was written by a woman, and it said, "Stop telling teenage boys that they're toxic."
Yeah.
And I think that's actually really important, because if you tell somebody something enough times, they'll start to believe it. It was something that we talked about Ryan before. It was something Ryan used to say about our young basketball players. It's like, if you tell a group of young players that they're soft enough times, they'll just believe you.
Right.
Like, that they won't take charges or that they won't dive on the floor. And basketball is just a silly example. But like, if you tell teenage boys you're toxic enough times, they'll be like, okay,
I guess that's what I am.
I guess that's what I am. So I'll just lean into it and just
Yeah.
watch me go,
Right.
instead of inviting them into um, another way of being, which is, I think, what we're trying to talk about when we talk about Jesus. And then this also leads me to, there's a reason why like the community matters, of surrounding our boys with adults, both male and female,
Hmm.
who, that when they're moving toward misogynistic tendencies or behaviors, or even uh, actually living it, to say, like, hey, I wonder, in this community, like, do you see that, like the checks in a community are actually really important,
Yep.
to say, like, actually there's a better way,
Right.
and I love you enough to invite you back into it.
Right.
um yeah,
We so our group at church who have like kind of surrounded us and taken us in here in Atlanta. We went on this retreat this last weekend, and I was thinking a lot about how cool that was just for our group and our kids. And like they had, these couples, like men and women that were like leaning in and like encouraging and loving our kids that just weren't even our own kids, all of the kids, right? And how
yeah,
important that was for us. And I see such value in that community. I'm so thankful that my son is being formed by his mother and by
Mm.
the women that are in there. But I also recognize the deep, deep value in not just like having them
Yeah.
form him, but having examples of good men walking it out
Yeah.
and being able to show my son what it is to be a good man,
Yeah.
right? And like without perfection and with our mistakes and our baggage that comes, like the daily strive to be the kind of man that Jesus calls us to be,
Mm.
right? And like I think that I really I can't think of a more valuable thing, right? I really can't think of a more valuable thing if we talk about like the kind of masculinity I want my son to know and understand.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Ditto.
this is something too, Reed, and I'm interested here. You and I like to give things names and titles. We're good at that. I
We
don't know if we're
sure
good at it. We
do.
like it though.
We
Uh,
really like it.
yeah, we're good at it. And so, one of the things we've been trying to like kick around a little bit is like, how do we like, what is something that we could help parents of boys, and even maybe like teachers, any like people that are influential to boys, how do we give them something that they can lean on that can be the start of a good conversation, right? So we've talked about courageous masculinity. We talked about courage and sacrifice being like kind of the pillars. I don't know.
Mhm.
What are your thoughts on those two kind of like titles there?
Yeah, I like that idea of giving like core tenets of
Right.
courage and sacrifice. And it allows you to have a deeper conversation about what that means. Like what type of courage are we talking about?
Sure.
And then what sacrifice of what? Um, yeah, and how those things actually play out.
We don't have this like solidified yet. It's something that kind of working on. We're workshopping, as they say. And we love for our listeners and people that watch us on YouTube to to lean into that with us, man. Like help us give a little bit of like where do you guys what are some words or terms? Does courageous masculinity seem to make sense? Does courage and sacrifice seem to be the place that we can start
Mhm.
with tenets as pillars of things we lean on? Are there other things that you would also add into that, right?
Yeah.
We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to hear from you and on Instagram. We'd love to hear from you on YouTube. We're gonna get the Apple Podcast up. You can comment there. It's gonna
We're
be
going.
amazing. They're all gonna be up there. It's gonna be wonderful. And then I think just in general, like in other ways to contact us, there's plenty of ways to connect with us, and we'll put them
Yeah.
all up on the internet. But lean into that with us, guys. Does it sound good?
Sounds great.
Reed, I love talking about this stuff with you, buddy.
This is fun.
All right, man. Well, let's do another one soon. What do you say?
Yep.
All right,
Thanks for
thanks for
listening to episode
listening.
11.
Bye,
Woo.
friends.